Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Books and Strikes. Books and Strikes is a show where we discuss books on baseball, and sometimes we take the cameras out on the road and we see what's happening regarding baseball in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Today we're going to be discussing a book which we've done a previous show on, but it was not completely covered, so we wanted to come back to the book and do another show. It's called Public Dollars, Private Stadiums, The Battle Over Building Sports Stadiums, written by Kevin Delaney and Rick Eckstein. Delaney is on the faculty at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia, and Eckstein is on the faculty at Villanova University, which is just outside of Philadelphia. Now, joining me on the show today is Eric Glick. And Eric is on the faculty at Park University in Kansas City, where he is program coordinator of public administration. He's also got his undergraduate degree from Lindenwood University, where he studied under me. And so one of a number of my students that have gone on to receive a Ph.D., and I've got a number that are still working on Ph.D. So I like to see that in a political science program, not that they just go for law schools, but eventually go on for PhDs. And you wrote a doctorate dissertation through the University of Texas at Dallas on the baseball stadium, the St. Louis Cardinals baseball stadium, and its economic development related to its maybe eventual, if it ever happens, baseball village.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And I also want to point out that I also got two graduate degrees here too, and one under you too.
Under me too.
Yes. So I'm gonna give you credit where credit's due.
All right, so let's come back to this book because we started to discuss it in a previous show. And just to summarize for people that had not seen this previous show, here is a book looking at a variety of cities. I particularly like looking at Cincinnati and Cleveland and Minneapolis and Hartford as sort of four good examples where what they're trying to say, there is something called a growth coalition. And the growth coalition within these cities is needed depending on how strong or weak they are to see the success or the failure in the development of the building of new sports stadiums, whether for baseball or football or basketball. And so they're trying to go through this whole notion of, okay, we're looking at cities where there are strong growth coalitions and cities where there are weak ones. And one of the themes that this is important to is when you have a strong growth coalition city, the cities they see as strong are Cincinnati and Cleveland. The weak ones they see are Minneapolis and Hartford, Connecticut. Now, then what happens is when you have a strong growth coalition, the sports team itself can stay in the background. Mm-hmm. And they don't have to step forward and push for, I want a new stadium. But when you have a weak city like Hartford or Minneapolis, the sports team itself has to be the visible public entity to step forward and say, I want a new stadium. And the problem there is it's like it's more acceptable to the public to not see the sports team advocating for a new stadium. It's better if they're in the background because it looks like, well, ownership, it looks like welfare for sports owners. You know, I mean, one of the themes certainly you get is I know people like to think in simplistic terminology of things are liberal versus conservative, and conservatives believe in the free market system. None of these owners in this book believe in the free market system. That's all nonsense. They all want public dollars so they can make a good chunk of change.
Yes, it's important to understand, and the book does a great job of saying, hey, Republicans, Democrats, we go through and we look and we see, hey, who is up for election? Who could take a hit? Who needs to be more vocal and so forth? And it's very important to understand that all these markets that we talk about, as if we talk about MLB or the NFL as a market, is not the case. These are artificial markets. Right. They're cartels. And these cartels have a lot of power. And within these cartels, these actual public officials are even giving them more power to prolong this sort of behavior and so forth. I talked about a little bit in the previous show and some of the research I do on the growth machine network model that I've come up with, and you can really apply it to just about anything. Oftentimes we talk about sports stadiums, but they do a good job of talking about convention centers or malls of the 80s, or now when you have a big department store, even like a Target or a Lowe's or so forth come in, because these are relatively small businesses when we talk about sports, that the catalyst is the sports teams, and if they can stay in the background, they're better off. Yeah. But the reality of it is the drivers have to be the public officials. So the sports teams, as the book does a good job of pointing out, don't want to take too much center stage because they're still business. Obviously, their self-interest is evident. But also the book does a good job of saying, while the business interest can be key, they have to also be careful of how much they're outright in the front. So the reality of it is the public officials generally tend to be the people that push it or sign off on it or make the proclamations, even if the reality of it is, as in some of the cases, the business interests are pretty much making the majority of decisions and the politicians are just rubber stamping them, which has had some large-scale repercussions in some of these cities long-term.
Which is interesting in the case of Cincinnati, because you're going to get a new stadium for the Cincinnati Reds baseball. You're going to get a new stadium for the Bengals for football. And the only reason they seem to have happened was by the sheer luck that the Cleveland Browns leave town.
Right.
Because you were having this threat of either or both the Reds, the Cincinnati Reds, and the Bengals leaving Cincinnati. So suddenly the public sentiment completely changes, because originally it was completely against the building of these stadiums. And one of them, like for the Bengals, had enormous cost overruns. I mean, and so again, you throw out these silly dollar amounts, and it's like, yeah, we're just giving that towards a benchmark. With what do we know for sure? Essentially, is what they're saying, but they don't want to say it. And now that the Browns have left St. Louis and have left Cleveland rather, and gone to Baltimore to become the Ravens. So now back in Cincinnati, they're sitting there going, well, what do you know? A team can actually pack up its bags and leave. I guess we better change our sentiment. And then they go ahead and they get what they want, but does it actually have any economic impact on Cincinnati? Basically, no.
No. And it's certainly the fear factor. And what's interesting, too, to be noted is the Cleveland Browns went to Baltimore. As we've talked about in previous shows, Baltimore actually passed something when their team left and basically just packed up the city at one point and actually became the Colts, is that they said, hey, no one else can ever leave us like this. But what's funny is Baltimore, recognizing that they need to become what they call a major league city, especially after a lot of this started with Camden Yards, said we have to have a football team. So we're going to take the Browns. Yeah. So even though they don't like when things are taken from them, they take teams in general too.
Interesting about Camden Yards, because that's sort of the first stadium everybody points to as there's the new type of baseball stadium. And then they all say, and look what it did for Baltimore. It brought economic development. Most good studies show you that none of that's true. The economic development began before Camden Yards went underway. So it isn't a cause and effect. Camden Yards leads to great economic development. The economic development was taking place without Camden Yards.
Well, and that's exactly the case. And what's interesting too is if you really, in another case, if you pick this up, is in San Diego, Luciano, who was very much involved in Baltimore with Camden Yards, went to San Diego, and what he was trying to do in San Diego is with their stadium, CK actually called it Camden Yards West, is how he looked at it. So if you start to see in some of these cases, a lot of these major players that are involved in other stadiums, or particularly builders like HOK, which is now called Populous, who build stadiums, who also built Camden Yards, is a lot of these players move around, and because these people are experts, they come in, and again, these people simply, whether or not the public officials want to admit it or not admit it, know more than they do. And because they know more, they tend to dictate better terms. But you can really start to see this network model, this growth machine, not only within these local growth coalitions, but kind of throughout the U.S., where it seems like everybody kind of knows everybody.
The other thing, and using this notion again that, well, you're going to build this new stadium and somehow it's going to be interrelated with economic development, growth in an area, and they're saying, no, that's not true. One of the things you see is that the newer stadiums are designed to almost make sure that people come into the stadium quickly, have a lot of things to do well before game time, in some cases hang around after the game. So as a result, you're sort of just running through the area where the stadium is located. So you're distinguishing between what grows up around a stadium that's only related and can be used just because when the stadium's there. Nobody's going to those bars outside of Busch Stadium when Busch Stadium isn't there, so essentially only during the 82 home games is it really any good.
Right, and there was a very interesting case there, even in, I believe it was Philadelphia, where they had asked if the games could, I believe it was Philadelphia, but it was one of them where they asked if the games could actually start later, if they could open at 7:30. Start up at 7:30 so they could actually absorb, or maybe it was Pittsburgh, where they could absorb some of this money, because basically people didn't even have time to go to the restaurants. So these restaurants were actually being hurt by the stadium. So again, the reality of it is, they used to talk about stadiums bringing economic development, but they look at business licenses. Basically, business licenses haven't changed, if anything, in amount given out. If anything, though, the quality of the businesses could change, because they're generally sports bars that only operate on those particular evenings. But then the real problem becomes, now that these stadiums are becoming more one-stop shops, like the Cardinals Stadium, is that people go down, they get there early, they eat, they have entertainment, they may play some games or so forth, they may have activities for the children. So then they go there, and actually some stadiums now even have after parties, or as the Cardinals do on Fridays, they have before parties. So they basically absorb almost all of that wealth, which actually goes to the sports team itself. So again, yes, this is incredibly problematic, if at all you're promising any sort of economic benefits. But the real shift has now become, while you're not getting economic benefits, the real question is, are you actually having negative, it seems like, economic benefits, if anything? So you're actually having a ripple of negative ripple opposed to a positive ripple.
In one city, they were talking about the idea that you had to figure out how to divide the opposition against the stadium. So they had the unions and they had black churches that were essentially united together. So what you did was, the supporters of the Growth Coalition went to the ministers of the black churches to say, this is good for your community, a nice vague generalization, because it's going to create jobs for inner city black residents. And so a number of these black churches bought into this nonsense, because this is what it ended up being, and they weren't jobs there.
Right, and they did that to actually, if you know, to defeat the unions. Which is interesting, because a lot of these same people would have been working for the unions. And then they said, well, we initially also offered 10% of the contracts, minority contracts, but particularly to what they were targeting was African Americans. Well, then they said, well, wait a second. We offered the 10%, but we knew this wasn't going to fly. So we actually, and it's pretty much verbatim, said, well, now we're going to offer 15%. The reality of it is, we probably can't offer 15%, because if anyone knows about how minority contracts work nowadays in affirmative action and court rulings, you can't just give minority contracts out if they're also not qualified. So the reality of it is, these were all these false promises. So these African Americans really never saw any benefits, and on top of it, of course, these African Americans are really suffering because of poor education in these cities, which also then leads to not being able to get jobs. So as you alluded to in the previous episode, basically these people just don't care. And these are actually politicians that are saying this. This is really, a lot of them are politicians say, hey, that's really not our problem.
Interesting that you end up having books like this, and the authors are talking, this is one of a number of very good books out there that are analytical and looking at and trying to explain sort of the idea of the enormous amount of money that the owners are making, the profits that they're increasing, and as a result you're seeing all this public dollars go to their benefit, and then the nonsense basically of the economic development associated with the stadium. So they generate, a lot of these then growth coalitions generate their own advocate studies that they're trying to make believe are on a par with the good academic studies. And so these academic studies, they have it's not like they have to advocate for or against, they're trying to understand And so when you're trying to look at something, it's different than being an advocate for it. So they go out there, and in one case they're talking about hiring Arthur Anderson, an accountant company, and the accountant company does some sort of a study, and it's incredibly shoddy, is the only way you could define it. Because it's a shoddy study. They went out, they interviewed some of the people that were in the baseball stadium and said how much money you're going to spend, and then they multiply that times the number of people in the stadium times the number of people in a season that attend a game and see how much money is going to be spent. And none of this made any sense because, one, they didn't separate out, say, the 20% that were children.
At least,
you know. So you're going, well, wait a minute. If you interviewed 100 people and you take those 100 people, you interviewed only adults. You didn't bother talking to any children. So in those 100, multiply them times the 50,000 in the baseball times the season. Here's how many dollars. Didn't make any sense. They didn't separate out tourists from locals. They didn't come up with any. It was sort of a silly. And I realize that when this stuff is mentioned on television, you can have somebody of this coalition simply say, well, we did a study, and what we're doing is finding out that the stadium will be bringing in the course of the season $42 million in consumer dollars. It's good for the local economy. And then you'd say, wait a second, let's back up. Where'd you get that $42 million? Well, we got it from doing a study done by a charlatan, essentially. You know, you didn't take a look at how the study was actually done, because that's what you do is, you know, I can sell this on television because all I have to do is say a study was done, not, you know, and the way I always present it to my students is you got to stop and think, is there a link between smoking and lung cancer? Let's see who did. Oh, what do you know that the old Tobacco Institute, sponsored by the tobacco industry, did the study? Well, you got to stop and figure out who did this study.
Well, and we talked about this a little bit last time, but as I always say, without transparency, you have conspiracy. Yeah. And clearly what's going on here is a lack of transparency. And there was a number of cases, too, where people actually had data in front of them, and they said, okay, we know that this is probably viable data, but how do we actually, in a nice way, if you want to say it, spin this so that we actually do not have to either talk about this data or directly actually deal with it? And again, a number of these places went from one day, literally, from economic benefits to the next day, community self-esteem, where whatever strategy it took to get this through, they were going to get it through. And it was outright in some of these even state legislatures where they said, hey, look, the reality of it is this is going to happen. So it's going to happen this way or it's going to happen another way. And in one of the cases, we know that 95% of the people probably do not want this. 95% of the people are wrong. We're right, they're wrong. We know it's in their own interests.
Yeah, the spin I thought was interesting regarding one of the cities wanted to use a tax on cigarettes and liquor. So you're calling it, the newspapers are calling it a sin tax, but the Growth Coalition is saying, no, we're going to call it soak the rich tax. So this way the idea was wait a minute, doesn't make any sense. Who's doing all the drinking and smoking here? You know, and so then you had this argument over what you should call this particular tax as a way of trying to put the proper spin on it. We only got a few minutes left to the public, and we recommended this in the previous show. This is a good book, and it is the sort that if you actually develop an interest in wanting to follow the St. Louis Rams and whatever will or will not, or what's going to happen regarding either fixing up the current stadium or whatever's going to happen. I'm still a bit confused. We're going to do a future show on that as I guess some of this gels more and we can take a look at it. Well, this is the sort of book that I think you need as a background to help you ask your own questions.
Yes, these are very complex situations, as we talked about, and I used some of these themes in my dissertation, and this particular book, or Delaney and Eckstein, really take a look at this a lot differently than most people do. And they really do a good job of, while looking at this in depth, also providing a relatively quick read. Now, if you don't have as much of a background as we do, some of this may be challenging, but it does give you a good glimpse and prepares you to at least start asking why. And ultimately, that's what the authors talk about, that they want people to ask why, because if you're not asking why, then the democratic process is not going on.
And basically, it's not in this book. Essentially, there is no democratic process.
Right.
Or when it has happened, you found a way to get around it.
Well, and they talk about, and the growth machine is really another way to talk about, and as you know, as you teach, is an oligarchy, which is really a rule of the few.
Yeah.
And so this is what they're really saying. And as a nation, not just as local government, we need to be concerned if there really is a rule of the few going on.
Good book. Thanks for joining us today.